I'm Haley for Classical ESL. If you've seen some of my other videos on lesson planning pointers, you know that I'm always going on and on about understanding your students' needs and goals and planning lessons based on those needs and goals. But what if you've never met the student and you don't know what their needs and goals are? Or maybe you've been teaching them for a little while and you can't figure out exactly what they need to learn. Besides just getting to know your student through conversation, there's a great teaching tool that a lot of online teachers overlook: placement tests. It sounds dry and really boring, but I'm going to do my best to make it fun and interesting. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the why, the what, and the how of making your own personalized placement test to use in your online tutoring business. Using placement tests will really boost your teaching game. Let's dive right into the why. Why are placement tests useful for teachers and students? Students might not be able to articulate or even realize what their strengths and weaknesses are. They leave it up to the teacher to tell them. Sometimes it can be hard to know the exact depth of knowledge that someone has based on a brief and kind of superficial conversation. Teachers need to know where to begin when it comes to planning specialized content for a new student they've just met. A placement test can meet everyone's needs without spending any of the paid lesson time on it. Kind of a cheap and easy way to get inside your student's head and figure out what they've learned and in which areas they're kind of lacking. This isn't the end-all be-all of planning your student's curriculum. The student can always provide additional study goals, and the teacher will be able to zero in on other issues the student might have with pronunciation, prosody, grammar and vocabulary deficiencies. The teacher will be able to figure that out through direct contact with the student in class. But placement tests can really act as an anchor to kind of structure the initial lessons and act as sort of a framework to build that beginning curriculum. Using a placement test also just sets a really professional tone going forward. Lets your student know what to expect. And as with everything, there are always some cons. So what are the possible pitfalls of using an online placement test? The student might just refuse to complete it flat out. The same way that some students don't do their homework, some students might completely blow you off and just not do the placement test. You can't force them to do it, and it's just more of an offer than anything else. Some students might be really averse to failure, and they will use Google and other resources to kind of find the answers to your questions instead of using the test the way it was intended, to measure the knowledge they already have. You'll be able to tell straight away if your student has done something like that, and it will kind of defeat the purpose of the test, but you can't prevent it from happening. Another issue is that the student may have mastered the one particular part of a grammar point that you are testing and might not have a grasp on the finer aspects of that grammar point. You can sort of mitigate this by writing your questions thoughtfully. Another possible issue is that your students might balk at the idea of being tested before you've even taught them anything. Calling it a diagnostic tool or a skill check-in might help to alleviate some of that test anxiety that some students feel. Classic placement tests are somewhat limited in that they only test grammar and vocabulary, so we would call these indirect, discrete tests. However, a teacher might implement other types of testing methods. They might test reading skills, writing skills, and recorded speech and listening activities. Some of these are still indirect, but there are also opportunities for direct testing, and these are more integrative, whatever that word is. They integrate more skills together. This type of testing is more onerous on teachers and students, so it's something to undertake with the knowledge that you will have to do more work to evaluate them. We'll get into that later. Using this expanded method with all of the skills involved might be a big ask for a shy student or a student who's just getting started. The student might already be very shy and nervous about hiring a tutor in the first place. So putting them on the spot right away before you've even met and asking them to record themselves speaking and send it to you might be a bit too much for them. So it's really important to think about where your student is coming from before you assign these kinds of tasks. I'll delve deeper into how to select different types of test questions later on in this video. A placement test does not replace the need for a teacher to evaluate the student through direct contact. A placement test will not give a teacher an idea of a student's overall ability to think and communicate in the target language. It's really just one tool in the teacher's repertoire to help the teacher it's really about knowing how to begin. Another important consideration is when to provide the placement test. There are a few different options here. You could send a link to the placement test before the initial meeting or trial class. Sending the student a well-prepared assignment before you've even met sends a very clear message that you are a professional, experienced teacher, and it sets the expectation that the teacher is going to come prepared to all of the lessons. If you don't plan to prepare things for classes and you are more of a teaching off the cuff kind of teacher, maybe using a placement test isn't quite right for you because it will set an unrealistic expectation. Using a placement test also signals to the student that there will be targeted, individualized content in every class. As I mentioned before, sending the placement test before the first class could be a little off-putting for a particularly shy or nervous student. However, this approach of sending the placement test in advance gives the teacher more time to figure out what kind of student they're going to come face-to-face with and to prepare accordingly. And the more prepared you can be in that first or trial lesson, the more likely a student is going to be to rebook with you or to buy a whole package of lessons. A placement test might not be ideal if a student is only planning to have a one-off class with you in order to prepare for an interview or have another very specific reason they want to meet with a native speaker. It's important to kind of suss out why your student is contacting you in the first place before you send a placement test. And communicating with the student before class is really going to be a great way for you to figure out if a placement test is even applicable. Another time when you could send the placement test is after the initial class or after the trial class. The benefit of sending the placement test afterwards is that you will have time to kind of prepare your student for what the placement test is all about, what the expectations are, how they should approach this test. For nervous students or for beginner students, you can emphasize the fact that it's not for a grade, it's not a way for you to judge them. It's simply a tool for the teacher to build a curriculum to help the student to reach their goals. Waiting until after the trial class can also be helpful if the student doesn't respond to messages from the time they book the class until the time the class happens, because you might arrive in that class and find that the student just wants to do free talk and just chat and have a really casual atmosphere, and in that case, the placement test just wouldn't be useful. Or the student might be very proactive and they might already have a plan of what they want to learn and they will tell you exactly what they want. Or a student might give you the syllabus from a class they're taking and ask you to essentially follow what that other teacher is doing. These are all possibilities. The drawback to waiting until after the first class to give the placement test is that you will feel slightly less prepared going into that trial class. But if you're an experienced teacher, this shouldn't really be a big deal. We meet new students all the time, and sometimes you know something about them, sometimes you don't. Trial classes are so free and easy that you shouldn't feel like you need to have something prepared specifically for that student. But it can be nice, and like I said, it's a great way to kind of project that professionalism and maybe hook a new student. You could also hold off on giving the placement test for a few lessons. This might be useful if the student starts off just wanting to have casual lessons. Maybe after a few lessons, it becomes apparent that the student is missing some of those requisite skills they need to achieve their language goals. And that would be a good time to introduce the placement test. This could help you to identify the student's exact level at that time. It can help the student onto a path towards making measurable progress. You could also use a placement test after several lessons have been completed. In this case, it might be more of a progress check. If the student took a placement test at the beginning of your tutoring relationship, then you could give another test in a similar format with different questions to kind of show the student, hey, look how far you've come, look how many things you've learned. Or conversely, you can use this test to show the student, hey, you're not really making the progress that you want to be making. And this might goad your student into doing more work outside of class. Say you have a student who never does the homework that you assign and doesn't seem to be putting in much effort. Giving them a progress check type of test might light a fire under them and show them that, hey, you're wasting your money and your time here. You need to be putting in more of an effort on your own outside of lessons. This shows them that the teacher can't really do everything, that tutoring isn't some kind of magic wand that makes you speak a language. This sounds kind of harsh, but this is something that some of our students might need to hear. So now we're in phase 2. How does a teacher go about writing a placement test, especially if you've never done it before, or if you don't have much of a background in education? How do you know which topics and questions should be included? And how should the test be structured? I'm not an expert in placement test development, but I've done some research on this and I feel like I've gleaned some of the important aspects to share with you. The first most important thing about creating the test is making the goal and scope clear to your student. Let them know why they're taking this placement test and let them know what the outcome really means. It doesn't mean they're good at this or bad at that. It's simply a way to say, hey, these are some things we can practice together. As you're sitting down to craft the questions for your placement test, you want to keep in mind the CEFR or the ACTFL language levels. CEFR is the European framework for language learning, and ACTFL is the American one. Often you will see charts that show ACTFL compared with CEFR. They basically do the same thing, they just use different terminology. I can make another video about CEFR and ACTFL if anyone is interested. The way I implement these frameworks into my testing is that I choose a handful of important topics that should be achievable by students of each level. I whittle it down to really what I think are the most important ones for each skill level. I start with A1 and I move all the way to C2. So that's novice to advanced. I like to order the questions from the easiest all the way over to the most difficult. I can imagine some arguments for mixing it up a little bit more so that maybe a student wouldn't get frustrated as the test gets progressively more and more difficult and give up. I like it that it moves from easiest to more difficult. That just really, it shows a progression. And if you've prepared the student correctly, they shouldn't give up just because it became too difficult. Ultimately, I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to set up the questions. It's going to be really based on teacher preference. It's important to really think about the purpose of each question. Like, why are you choosing to test this exact grammar point? How will choosing this grammar point influence the way that you build the curriculum? Earlier in this video, I mentioned direct and indirect testing and discrete versus integrative testing. These are different factors that you would use to create a placement test or other types of tests, really. My approach to placement testing comes from an indirect, discrete perspective. This means that I give multiple choice questions, and each question focuses on one specific grammar point or vocabulary item. You could mix in some direct questions, which would be short answer, something with writing or recorded speech. You could also have these direct questions be integrative, meaning each one would include the need for multiple grammar points and various vocabulary items. This would more accurately mirror a real-world task-based situation, but it's also more difficult when it comes to testing and evaluation. Using integrative direct testing is a more holistic approach, but I'm not sure if it's truly realistic for online placement tests. There are benefits and drawbacks to each of these types of testing, and it's really up to each teacher to determine what they want to test and how they're going to evaluate it. If you are offering a class that's focused on writing, then yes, you probably need to use a more direct testing approach. I tend to teach general English, vocabulary, and grammar, so for me, indirect, discrete testing does the job just fine. So think about your purposes and build your test accordingly. If anyone is interested in hearing more about indirect and direct testing and discrete versus integrative testing, please just drop me a comment down below and I will create a video all about that. Another thing to think about is how many questions should be on the test. This one is debatable and it really depends on the teacher. The placement test that I'm currently using only has 30 questions. This means that I'm probably missing out on a lot of important things from CEFR and ACTFL, but really, I picked and chose things that I thought were really, really important, and each question that I have will result in planning around a very kind of large, broad grammar point. I don't use my placement test as the end all be all. So it's really just a jumping off point. And then as I meet with the student more and more, I take notes of, hey, this student can't do relative clauses right. Or when this student forms questions, their words are all jumbled up. Or the student habitually uses an incorrect irregular past tense. These kinds of things might show up on your discrete placement test. They might not. It's important to keep in mind that this is not going to tell you everything you need to know about your student. Aside from diagnosing grammar and vocabulary issues, I also use my placement test form as a learning goals questionnaire. I included a lot of questions asking students to rate their feelings about using the target language. So I say things like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable do you feel speaking English? How comfortable do you feel writing in English? I ask students questions about what they want their teacher to do for them, which types of materials they think are most useful. I ask the student questions about their learning style. I also ask the student to try to tell me what they think their strengths and weaknesses are. Sometimes they're not very accurate, and sometimes they're not good at self-diagnosing. So I set up the form so that they could leave those blank if they wanted to. And speaking of the form, how do you even go about making your own online placement test? Personally, I use Google Forms. It's kind of a universal platform that works all around the world. I've sent it to some students who said, hey teacher, I can't actually get into the form. For certain countries, they might need to use a VPN, and you can instruct your students how to do that or send them some materials that will help them figure out a VPN. One thing though, I think for students in China, it might not be possible to use Google Forms. Just something to consider. So now I think we're going to jump on over to VoiceOver because it will be a lot easier for me to show you how I make a test in Google Forms rather than just tell you about it. I'm not the most tech-oriented person, but this is something I can do, thankfully. Even if you already know how to use Google Forms, you might want to stick around because I think there are some tips in this section of the video that will help you out.
Obviously, to access Google Forms, you can go to the Google homepage. Click the little menu button in the top right corner next to your profile image. Scroll until you see the Forms icon. Click on New Form. Now you're on the page where you can build your placement test. You should click over to Settings to set it up as a quiz so that your placement test can have all of the quiz features, like point values and correct answers. The Settings menu also has other options like making all of the questions default to required, and you can set the default point values for each question. You could collect email addresses from respondents, but I don't. Now we're back to the questions page. We want to give it a title and write some instructions for the test taker. Now you're ready to add your questions. Just type your question in the box and add some answers to choose from. I always give "I don't know" as the last option because I don't want the student to guess if they actually have no clue. This will help you when you are evaluating the responses. You can add the correct answer. You can also include explanation text that pops up if your student gives an incorrect response. I do multiple choice for my indirect discrete questions, but there are several different question formats. Some are good for placement tests, and other question types would be better for the tutoring preferences questionnaire. You can play around with all of these formats. Once you've completed your placement test and you're ready to send it to your student, you can go to the top and choose Make a Copy. Then just rename the new file with the student's name. This will make it easy to keep all your students' answers separate. Now copy the link. I use the shortened form and send it to your student. You can go back to the Google Forms main page to check the responses to each copy you've made. And there you have it. Easy free placement tests that demonstrate your professionalism as a teacher. One of my regular students told me that he chose me out of all the tutors on italki because my placement test convinced him that I'm a serious teacher.
So now at this point, you have written your test questions, created your Google form, you've sent the link to your student, they have filled it out, and now you're on the step of evaluating those responses. If you're like me and you use the indirect discrete method, then it's pretty simple. I use the computer grading system, so my student sees their results immediately. and I can just kind of scroll down and see which answers they got right, which ones they got wrong, and take a peek at their learning goals questionnaire. It doesn't take much time at all. However, if you go for a more direct or integrative approach, you're going to have to do more in terms of evaluation. You'll either need to develop a rubric to grade the students' responses, or you'll sit down and make a list of all of the errors and weaknesses and then try and build that list into a logical and coherent curriculum plan. Totally doable, but it will take a little bit more time and effort on the part of the teacher. Ultimately, the choice of whether or not to use a placement test rests with each teacher, and a teacher might choose to use a placement test for some students and not for others. It really comes down to what the student tells you in the first few messages and what you learn about the student in the trial class that will help you to figure out whether using a placement test will be helpful for the student and teacher. I hope this video has helped you to see the merits of placement testing, and I hope that this information will help you to build your online tutoring business. Please remember to like and subscribe to this channel if you find it to be useful. Thanks so much for watching. Make every class your best class. Bye!